Good day. Today is Monday, 2nd March 2026, and before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. If once you've watched and listened to this program, or whichever part of this program you wish to watch and listen to, you decide that you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Well, today is, I believe, the third day of the war between the United States and Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other. And I think war is absolutely the right word to use to describe what is taking place. To repeat again, it is a war which was initiated by the United States and Israel with the explicit objective set out by the President and some of his officials, but especially by the President of the United States, in the clearest language, a war intended to achieve regime change in Iran, a war that was clearly intended to result in the overthrow of the current Iranian government and of its political system. In my last program, the video that I did yesterday, I quoted extensively from a statement published by the Russian Foreign Ministry in response to the attack on Iran, and it made that explicit point as well, that the attack against Iran is being conducted in order to change the governmental and political system in Iran. In other words, in order to achieve regime change there. And when one country, or as in this case, two countries, attack another country, in this case Iran, with the objective of changing that country's government, then by any definition, that is a war. It is not merely a clash or a conflict. It is clearly a war that is intended to achieve the biggest possible outcome that one can achieve in respect of the country that is being attacked. So I have no hesitation in referring to this as a war, except, of course, that I suspect that President Trump and his officials, and probably Prime Minister Netanyahu and his officials, and probably the leaders of the Arab Gulf states, who clearly knew that a war was coming, and, as reports now say, in the case of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, actually urged on this war. I suspect that all of these leaders, perhaps the European leaders as well, imagined that it would end quickly, that with the elimination of the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, there would be a rapid change of government. They probably internalized and accepted all of the things that they've been saying to each other for the last few years, and especially since the protests in January, that the government in Iran was unpopular, that it lacked legitimacy, that the people of Iran were yearning to overthrow this government, and perhaps they also believed, and maybe had some reason to believe, that military units in Iran would rebel against the political leadership of Iran, would seek to overthrow the government of Iran, rendering this war quickly over, successful in a short period of time. And, well, we've had many things happen over the last 2 days, but the calculus of this war remains the same. It is a test of endurance. Iran has survived 2 full days of war, or to be more precise, the political system, the government in Iran, has withstood 2 major days of attacks by the United States and by Israel. And the longer this continues and that government remains in place, the more difficult it becomes for the United States, and by the way, for Israel too, and even more so, and most pressingly of all, for the various Arab states of the Gulf region, the more critical and dangerous the situation becomes for them, politically and in all other respects. And, well, eventually we will move from the very difficult situation that is already starting to emerge to a potential crisis when it becomes clear that the United States is locked in a long war with Iran, which is exactly what the president and his officials at various times made clear that they wished to avoid. So that is where we are today. Iran is still standing. The governmental system is still functioning. There is no sign of mass protests against the government. On the contrary, it appears that hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions of people, have turned out across Iran to voice their support for the government and the current political system, which, of course, in a moment of crisis like this, they are, as people in countries that are under attack tend to do, conflating with the country itself. And, well, we will see whether that continues. We will see whether in the days and weeks ahead, this apparent unity in Iran is maintained. Because, as I've said, if it is, then it seems to me that Donald Trump, the United States, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Israel, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf rulers, they're all going to find themselves in considerable trouble. Anyway, having said all of these things, let's actually look at some of the things that have been happening over the last 2 days. The first is that I do want to discuss now, I haven't discussed it up to now, the attack on the school that took place in Iran, which has apparently resulted in the mass death, the killing of around 150 schoolgirls. A tragic event, an event that has been massively publicized inside Iran, one which has caused enormous grief to the families of the children that were killed, as by the way it should, one which has been disastrously, appallingly underreported in the West. Now, in the hours after that attack came, that strike on the school came, there were lots of reports that the school had been hit by an Iranian missile, an air defense missile, and these reports circulated in the West. I was waiting to see whether that would remain the case. I'd heard that there was an investigation being conducted by various media outlets in the West. CNN is now saying that the attack on the school, the missile that struck the school, was a missile launched either by Israel or by the United States, and which was targeting a nearby Iranian military base, but which went astray. Well, can I say that is something, these kind of appalling tragedies do take place in wars. The point to make here is that I assume, I cannot imagine, in fact, that whose ever missile it was that struck that school intended to strike that school and to kill all of those children. But it's not just a case in this case, of a missile going astray, of a mistake like that being made. In this particular case, this attack on the school, this destruction of the school, all of those deaths in the school, is a product also of the surprise attack that was launched on Iran in the first few hours. It was during those first few hours that that missile hit the school. The Iranians were given no previous warning that an attack was coming. They did not, therefore, take the kind of precautions that they might have taken if they'd been given a warning that an attack of this kind, an attack of the kind that has taken place, rather, the kind of bombing and missile strikes on Iran that began on Saturday, that they were going to happen. So the result was that there was no widespread alert against Iran to keep the children away from the schools, to evacuate children, to take precautions against the possibility of missile and bombing strikes, which might result in the kind of tragedy which we saw at the school. And again, that reflects the extraordinarily cynical, I would say lawless way in which this whole operation has been conducted. To repeat again a point that I've made, there was no referral of what was alleged to be a preemptive threat from Iran to the UN Security Council. I say that some American officials have been briefing the media that the United States was anticipating a preemptive attack by Iran. I don't believe that. I don't think anybody takes that seriously. And other media outlets in the United States that have consulted the Pentagon, or at least some officials in the Pentagon, have now been told that the Pentagon had no information, no reason to believe that a preemptive strike by Iran was taking place. So had there been any serious risk of an attack from Iran, the correct thing to do would have been to go to the UN Security Council to seek authority from the Security Council to take action. Of course, that was never done. Putting that aside, the UN Charter in these matters is absolutely clear. In the event that there is a genuine situation where a country has either been attacked or expects to be attacked, it must take the matter to the UN Security Council as soon as possible. Of course, the United States and Israel have done no such thing. The matter was reported to the Security Council. The attack on Iran was reported to the Security Council, not by the United States and Israel, but by Iran, China, and Russia, just saying. So no such steps were taken, steps which, as I said, would have alerted the Iranian authorities to what was happening and might have resulted in an evacuation of the schools, and nor was any authorization for a military attack on Iran sought from Congress, about which I would have thought there were enormous question marks, constitutionally speaking. But again, had such a step been taken, it too might have made it possible, or might have resulted in the schools being evacuated, avoiding the kind of tragedy that we have seen. Now here I have to bring this up. I am reminded of the first days of the special military operation which Russia initiated against Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022. There'd been extensive negotiations and discussions before then. There'd been a meeting, a televised meeting of the Russian Security Council on the 21st of February 2022, over the course of which the Russian authorities decided that they would extend international recognition to the two Donbass republics, Donetsk and Lugansk. There was also steps taken ahead of the launching of the special military operation itself, which could be said to have been calculated to limit the risk of mass civilian casualties. And of course, the Ukrainians would have been alerted anyway, because I seem to remember that it was about 2 days before Russia and the two Donbass republics completed a defense treaty, and there was a request from the two Donbass republics for military assistance to be provided to them in light of what they claimed was an imminent Ukrainian attack upon them, and an announced decision by Russia that it would provide that assistance. So the Ukrainians would have had plenty of notice that something was coming, and that would have been notice sufficient to take precautions to protect civilians. Though I don't remember whether any such precautions were made. And of course, in the first days of the special military operation, as I also remember, the Russians went out of their way to say that they were looking to avoid causing civilian casualties, that they would not attack civilian infrastructure. There was much commentary at the time about how understated the initial Russian military actions were. I remember that it caused surprise amongst some Western military commentators. But again, the point is that it would have avoided the kind of incident we saw with the school. So, as far as I'm concerned, I accept that probably the United States and Israel, in fact, definitely the United States and Israel, did not intend to attack the school, but they must be held responsible in light of their violations of all normal, legal, lawful procedures for the fact that the tragedy took place and that so many innocent schoolgirls were killed, and that there was such a tragic outcome for those schoolgirls and for their families. Anyway, that is what I wanted to say about this incident. To repeat again, it has not been properly reported, but it seems to me that the points I've just made are really uncontestable. The United States and Israel have said that they are taking the steps they are to safeguard lives, mostly in Israel. But of course, it is lives in Iran that are being lost. And it's perhaps important to remember that even as I and others mention the fact that Iran is still standing, as of this moment in time, by far the greater casualties are being suffered in Iran, 500 plus, according to some reports, civilian casualties, I mean, not in other places, though it is the case that some civilians have died in other places, in Israel, in some of the Gulf states as well. Anyway, that's one thing I do want to say. I've noticed that increasingly now the Russians in particular are referring to this operation as a US-Israeli aggression against Iran. Aggression is, of course, an international crime. At the Nuremberg trials in 1945-46, it was defined as the greatest of all international crimes. Vladimir Putin is a lawyer, as I never cease to point out. The fact that he's talking in this way, the fact that the Russian government is talking in this way, well, it tells you a great deal about what the Russians think of this whole affair. But again, I cannot see at all that what they say about this attack can be challenged. Now, of course, given the rhetoric about might is right and all of that we hear from people in the Trump administration and have been hearing from people in the Trump administration over the last few months, and given the widespread cynicism that you will find all around the world about international law, about war crimes, about the role of the United Nations, people will say, what does this matter? Well, of course, it will matter a great deal if this operation proves to be a failure. And as I've said already, if Iran continues standing, if Iran is still able to hold together, if its government and political system remain intact over the next few days and weeks, so that it starts to look as if this operation is going to fail, well, then I suspect that it will start to matter a great deal. President Trump, for example, never ceases to say that the war in Ukraine is pointless and senseless. He says that nothing is being achieved by it. The war in Ukraine, as it happens, was not pointless or senseless, at least not from a Russian point of view. The Russians have always spoken about the eastward expansion of NATO, which is a fact. They've spoken about Ukraine's alignment with NATO and its wish to join NATO, which, by the way, is also a fact. They've spoken about the threat of Ukraine joining NATO to their security, which is contested, but it is no doubt at all what they sincerely believe and have talked about many times. And of course, they also talk about the deep political crisis within Ukraine since the events of 2014, the Maidan seizure of power in 2014, which is also, by the way, a fact, and about the discrimination against Russian speakers in Ukraine as well, and the eventual banning of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which actually is a fact as well. By contrast, this attack on Iran is indeed pointless. Iran was nowhere close to obtaining a nuclear weapon. It has repeatedly forsworn plans to acquire a nuclear weapon. It has made proposals that would have satisfied any reasonable concerns about risks that it might acquire nuclear weapons. The Pentagon is telling journalists in the United States that there was no preemptive threat from Iran. There was no danger to any country in the Middle East from Iran. There was no danger, immediate proximate danger to Israel from Iran. This, it seems to me, is the actual pointless and senseless war. Anyway, let's turn to what has been happening over the last 24 hours. Firstly, Iran, quite intentionally, has been striking more American bases across the Middle East. It has also been striking American and Israeli facilities in Israel itself. It is expanding the reach of its strikes. It struck bases, British bases in Cyprus, which were being used to assist in this joint American-Israeli operation against Iran. And it has been trying to launch missiles in the direction of the USS Navy carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, though, as I've discussed in many programs, as that carrier is a moving target, the Iranians up to now have not been able to do it any damage. Perhaps they won't succeed, but then again, the longer this conflict continues, the greater the chances that something might hit the Lincoln eventually, a possibility that the American authorities must consider. In the meantime, the government in Iran is functioning. Ali Larijani, the head of the Iranian security and military apparatus, appears to be firmly in control. The United States and Israel also, of course, continue their strikes against Iran, mostly, as far as I can see, concentrated against Tehran. And there's no doubt that they are doing significant damage to facilities in Tehran itself. They also claim to have degraded Iran's air defense system, though they made the same claim in June 2025. It looks as if there was some kind of Iranian air defense system functioning, that has been functioning over the last few days. There is film of Iran shooting down American drones over Iran. It looks as if some sort of air defense system over Iran continues to function, though obviously not at the optimal level. But the point is, Iran continues to strike targets across the Middle East, and it is not difficult to understand the Iranian strategy. The Iranian strategy is indeed exactly the strategy that one would have predicted that Iran would follow. It is striking targets, forcing the United States, and it ultimately is the United States, to forward position its air defense systems across the entirety of the Middle East, not just Israel now, but all the Gulf states, and presumably before long Cyprus. And the United States has to launch air defense missile interceptors to try to prevent attacks on all of these military and base facilities across the Middle East that it has. And incidentally, and this I think is part of the explanation of the Iranians launching drone attacks on some civilian facilities in some of the Gulf states, because the Gulf states have long expected and assumed that the United States would provide them with protection. And so the United States, having made that long-term commitment to the Gulf states, must also at least make some effort to protect the Gulf states from these kind of attacks too. And that places still further demands on the American air defense systems. So what the Iranians are doing is they are overextending the US air defense system. They are forcing the United States to deplete its air defense missile arsenal, already heavily depleted, as a result of the long commitment the United States has made to Ukraine. The United States is forced to deplete that system in order to protect targets from Iranian attack right across the entirety of the Middle East, and now Cyprus as well. And of course, there are not just missiles, the Iranians have been launching missiles against some of these facilities, and there is some evidence that some of these missiles are getting through. One missile, for example, or at least maybe more than one missile, Iranian missile, seems early on in the war to have destroyed an important American air defense radar. Just saying. But anyway, some of the missiles are getting through, but this is where the Iranian drones come in. Because yes, the drones can be shot down, but it takes lots of missiles to shoot down these drones. There are huge numbers of drones produced in Iran. Drones can be produced in very, very large quantities. But apart from one laser system, which the United States has apparently loaned to Israel, which is experimental, and about which we know very little, the US ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, has been talking about it. The only defense against drones at the present time is using more and more air defense missiles. And the United States has to use those missiles if it is going to protect the civilian facilities in places like Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, ultimately Saudi Arabia as well, from these Iranian drone attacks. Otherwise, it risks making the leaders of those countries feel betrayed and abandoned. So this is the Iranian strategy, and the Iranians are also doing something else. They are now clearly obstructing access through the Sea of Hormuz. There have been attacks on tankers. Some tankers have been attacked and have been set on fire. Apparently, insurers are unwilling now to provide insurance for tankers that try to navigate past the Straits of Hormuz. There were lots of reports over the weekend of a huge pile-up of tankers in the Persian Gulf, unable to access the Arabian Sea because passing through the Straits of Hormuz has become too dangerous. This is creating a major bottleneck in oil exports from the Gulf. There were reports yesterday that OPEC Plus is trying to increase oil production in order to smooth out bottlenecks in order to smooth out any rise in oil prices caused by this ongoing crisis. But of course, if 20% of the oil supply, global oil supply, cannot transfer through the Straits of Hormuz, given that some of the big oil producers are located along the Gulf, then it's difficult to see what increasing oil production can achieve. And in fact, today, there are reports that oil prices have increased by, some say, 20-25%. I'm not sure of the exact figures. And that the cost of liquefied natural gas, much of which is exported from Qatar, that is increasing as well. So these are exactly what you would expect the Iranians to do when faced with what is increasingly looking like a war of attrition, a war against their country. They're engaging in a war of attrition. They are causing the United States to run down its missile arsenals, and they are putting economic pressure on the United States and on the Western countries, and by the way, the Gulf oil producers, by obstructing energy exports through the Persian Gulf, through the Straits of Hormuz. And all of this was completely predictable. In fact, the Iranians never made any secret of it. And it is exactly what we are seeing. Now, on the American side, I have to say that even though I understand the Iranian military strategy, which I've discussed now at some length, I am completely unable to understand what the American and Israeli military strategy is. Of course, the United States, the president and his officials have come up with various objectives that they say they have to completely end Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, something which might take months to achieve, depending on how big Iranian missile stockpiles are, and which will never be completely achieved if you add to those missile stockpiles drone stockpiles as well, which, as we see, can also do significant damage and which also need to be shot down as well. But anyway, they talk about that. They talk about preventing Iran from deploying or developing a nuclear weapons capability. Well, they said that they'd achieved that during the June 2025 war. They obviously didn't. Otherwise, they wouldn't be starting this operation all over again, though this time on a bigger scale. They've just apparently attacked an Iranian nuclear facility at Arak. I believe this is some kind of larger facility. I'm not quite sure what it involved. I'm not going to get into that discussion. But the key point anyway is that even if the United States claims that the purpose of it conducting these strikes is to deplete ballistic missile capabilities and nuclear capabilities, the president himself, his officials, have, as I said at the outset of this program, made it quite clear that their objective is regime change. I do not know what the strategy now for achieving regime change actually is, what the military strategy is. Obviously, launching missiles at Iran is going to kill an awful lot of people in Iran. It is going to do a great deal of damage to Iran. But all past precedent argues against air campaigns by themselves achieving regime change. I have to say that as things stand at the moment, it seems to me increasingly as if the actual plan, was a very simple one. It was to kill Khamenei. It was to kill the top leadership of the Iranian military and security forces, and to assume that once that happened, regime change would automatically follow, that there would be a massive uprising against the government across Iran, that there would be a resumption of the protests that we saw in January, only this time on a far bigger scale, that the Iranian government would be unable to control the situation, and following on comments made by Seymour Hersh and by John Bolton, that sections of the Iranian military would defect and would act against the existing Iranian government. And on this, we have had some information which casts the killing of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, in a different light, in a particularly sinister light, because the latest reports that I am seeing is that there was indeed a big meeting going on in Khamenei's residence when the Americans and the Israelis struck. That Khamenei was indeed meeting with the top military officials, that all of the people who were killed, all the top Iranian officials who were killed in the first few hours, were indeed killed because they were at this meeting, that this is where the defense minister, the chief of the general staff, the head of police intelligence, the head of the IRGC, that they were indeed all together meeting with Khamenei in his residence. And that the reason they were there was, again, because they'd received indications via the Omani mediators of a new offer that was being made to Iran in connection with the negotiations that were taking place between the Iranians and the Americans. The negotiations that took place in Geneva last week and which were expected to resume in Vienna this week. And it was in order to discuss this American proposal that all of these Iranian officials were brought together to one place. And, as has happened far too many times, it happened last year in the case of Iran. It happened with Hamas, the Hamas negotiators who were attacked in Qatar. The Iranians, again, fell for the trick. They all came together. They all met in Khamenei's residence. And it was all a trick. It was all a trap to bring them into one place so that they could be killed in the way that they were. Now, I have to say, if this is true, it again astonishes me that the Iranians were caught by this same trick again. I appreciate that this type of compulsive duplicity for the Israeli and American governments is like nothing we have ever seen before in modern history. But nonetheless, we now have a clear pattern of it, starting from June of last year. And I would have thought that by now the Iranians would be alert to it, especially given all of the other indications that I discussed in my program yesterday, that an attack of that kind, an attack by the United States and Israel against Iran was coming. But for the record, I believe that this is indeed what happened. I appreciate that many people still think that Khamenei deliberately exposed himself so that he could become a martyr. He undoubtedly did anticipate martyrdom, as he would call it, as a result of an American military operation, any renewed American military operation. He is on record as saying in the past that his greatest wish would be to end his life as a martyr. But I do not believe that that was how he came to die on Saturday. If that was his intention, he would surely not have had his family still in his residence with him, including his little granddaughter, of whom pictures have appeared, and who also died over the course of that attack with him. It looks to me, again, as if it was an attack, a cynical attack, by Israel, and the United States. And here perhaps it's worth referring to the language of the Russian readout of the telegram message that was sent by the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, to President Pezeshkian of Iran. Because that message, a message which seems to have been written by Putin himself, also used the word cynical in connection with the means in which Khamenei's death was brought about. And that word cynical suggests to me that the Russians, who were being kept very closely briefed about the progress of the negotiations in Geneva and generally, also know that it was a trap that Khamenei and all of those other Iranian officials fell into. Now, I've said in the past that it seemed to me as if Khamenei, who, in my opinion, contrary again to what is often said in the West, was, in terms of the Iranian leadership, a relative moderate, seemed to have difficulty understanding the ruthlessness of some of the people he was up against. Well, his decision to call together this meeting in this way and to allow his family to remain in the residence, to my mind, shows that, confirms that. And again, I cannot imagine that the much tougher, far more cynical, if you like, officials who have taken his place, people like Larijani, are going to let themselves be tricked in the same way. But to repeat again, that seems to me to have been the entirety of the American plan. Bring everybody together, bring Khamenei, bring the defense minister, the head of the IRGC, the chief of staff, the chief of security, the intelligence service of Iran's police, all of these people together in the same place with Khamenei and kill them, and then call on the Iranian people to rise up and overthrow their government. And as far as I could see, that was the entirety of the American plan. Now, that plan has not worked, and I don't for the moment see any other. The Americans continue, as I said, to strike Iran, but going back to that point about wars being pointless and senseless, these attacks now, unlike the Iranian attacks on the bases and the facilities across the Middle East, these attacks do seem to me to have an almost mechanical, aimless quality about them. All they are doing in political terms, and it is important always to remember that war is or should be, as Clausewitz said, an extension of politics. It should always serve a political outcome. All that this does is deplete further American arsenals, both of defensive and offensive weapons. So anyway, there it is. That's where we are. We are also getting more reports of more American losses. Over the last few hours, it turns out that 3 American fighter jets have been shot down over Kuwait. The Iranians, of course, are claiming that it was they who shot them down. How they did that, whether they have air defense systems capable of reaching Kuwaiti territory? I don't know. Perhaps rather more plausibly, it is being explained away as a friendly fire incident, that these fighter jets, these American fighter jets, were shot down by the Kuwaiti air defense system. But we can see that these air defense systems, even if they're using advanced missiles, these air defense systems in the Gulf are not functioning particularly effectively. Perhaps one should not be surprised about this. And shortly before I started this program, I read a report that the UAE, which has already used up billions of dollars of air defense missile interceptors, is starting to warn that its air defense missile interceptor arsenal is becoming very thin. And where the UAE leads, sooner or later the others will follow, all of the various Gulf states. And already I've seen a report from one Saudi commentator. It's important to stress that he's not a Saudi government official, but he's already complaining that the United States is not providing the Gulf states with the level of protection that they expected from these Iranian missile and drone attacks, and that the United States is prioritizing the defense of Israel above them, and there is already talk of betrayal. The Gulf states have found themselves in a particular crisis. They have, for many years, boasted of the fact that even as the rest of the Middle East, all of the other countries in the Middle East, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Algeria, Northern African states, find themselves in permanent crisis, they, because they are so friendly with the United States and because they maintain some kind of relationship with Israel, have been prospering. They've been building their gigantic skyscrapers and their glittering modern cities. They've been engaging in pharaonic projects like the Saudi Crown Prince's extraordinary, fantastical city in the desert. And now they find that instability that has existed all across the Middle East has reached them. And unsurprisingly, there have been many reports of panic and perhaps a further sign that they're starting to become increasingly unhappy about the low level of protection that they've been getting from the United States. A further sign that this is the case is that they have turned to someone else. Over the last few hours, the King of Bahrain, the President of the UAE, and the Emir of Qatar have telephoned or have been speaking on the telephone. I don't know who initiated the calls, to no less a person than Vladimir Putin of Russia. And of course, again, over the course of within the Russian readouts of all of these calls, we see the Russians again referring to the US-Israeli aggression against Iran. It's likely that these three rulers have not joined in the use of that kind of language. But I noticed that all three joined with the Russians, with Putin, in calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities. Now, that brings us back to the President of the United States, to Donald Trump, Because, of course, he also has previously spoken quite clearly, without any room for doubt, that it is regime change in Iran that he has been seeking. He wrote on True Social right at the start of the operation that this was the great opportunity for the Iranian people to come out on the streets, to take over to take back their government, to take back their country. In other words, to overthrow the political system that governs them. Political allies of the president, including Senator Lindsey Graham, have been saying the same thing, increasingly plaintively, on American talk shows. There seems to be some bewilderment, bafflement that this hasn't happened, that the killing of Khamenei has had the exact opposite effect. It has caused large numbers of Iranians to flood into the cities, into the streets and squares of Iranian cities, to speak out in support of their government, not against it. And over the last few hours, we have had a cascade of reports in the US media and from Trump himself about restarting negotiations with Iran, about how Iran supposedly wants a deal, how it was unfortunate that things had to get this far, and that he was pushed into doing this because the Iranians had not shown any interest in a deal up to now, which, as I said, given what actually happened in Geneva last week, is a grotesque distortion of the truth, just to say. But anyway, he's been talking about this, and he's been talking in ways that clearly suggest that he wants to find some way to end this thing. And the Wall Street Journal, obviously briefed by some of his officials, also said that the United States and Iran were moving back towards some sort of negotiation process. So, after launching this whole operation with the objective of achieving regime change in Iran, Donald Trump, perhaps sensing that things are not going according to plan. In fact, I get the clear sense that he's becoming increasingly worried that things have not turned out as he expected. It appears to now be looking for some kind of off-ramp. He wants to talk about negotiations with Iran. He's said that he expects this operation to last at most 4 weeks. Perhaps that's the absolute limit of what the United States can sustain. Just saying. That, of course, has produced some dismay from some of the hardliners. They're coming back. I've seen commentaries, especially in Israel, saying that it is going to be impossible to achieve regime change in Iran within just 4 weeks, which looks increasingly as if it may be true. Anyway, he's giving the first initial signs of wanting an off-ramp. Well, the Iranians have come back. We've had a statement from Larijani. Iran is not interested in negotiations. In other words, the Iranians, again, exactly as they indicated before the attack took place, see negotiations, further negotiations with the United States as a trap, which, by the way, given the record, they obviously are, as an attempt by the United States to buy time, and the Iranians have no interest in negotiations at this time. They will only negotiate when they sense that the United States, because of the economic pressure from rising oil prices, the depletion of its arsenals, finds itself in a far weaker position than the one it is in at the moment. And it is only then, perhaps in 4 weeks' time, that the Iranians will come back and say that they're prepared to talk. Larijani's statement, by the way, rejecting negotiations, seems to me a good indication that he and the rest of the Iranian political and security apparatus in Iran believe that they have the internal situation in Iran firmly under control. Just saying. Well, none of that surprises me. But there is a further factor that most commentators up to now have not been thinking about, which is that if the United States has not set out a clear military and political strategy, if it is starting to retreat from its regime change objective but has not come up with any coherent other one, if it cannot find a simple off-ramp, the Iranians on their side, though they do appear to have a coherent military strategy, they so far have not set out any political objectives. They have not set out what their demands, if they ever do find themselves in a stronger position, might be. The most they have said is that if there is going to be an end to the fighting, it must take a form which will guarantee that there is no renewed attack on Iran by the United States or Israel in the future. Now, what would this mean in practice? The fact that Israel has had to seek the assistance of the United States to carry out this attack on Iran shows that Israel by itself does not have sufficient resources to defeat Iran by itself and to achieve regime change there. So it ultimately comes down to the United States. What would the Iranians seek from the United States that would guarantee that there would be no future American attack on Iran of the kind that we're going through and which we saw in June? Well, previously, I remember that there were discussions, internal discussions in Iran, in the domestic Iranian media, of the need to close down all US bases in the Middle East. US bases in the Arabian Peninsula, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, and in Jordan. What happens if in 4 weeks' time the United States, short of missiles, with energy costs rising, with increasing pressures on the European economies and on the American economy, with the president worried about the effect of all of that in the midterms? What happens if in 4 weeks' time the Iranians say, right, we are prepared to end this war, but only on condition that the United States dismantles its entire military infrastructure in the Middle East. Well, I don't want to speculate. I think that for the United States agreeing to such a thing would be all but impossible politically. I doubt that any US president confronted with such a demand could agree to it. I think that this has every potential to trigger a major political crisis within the United States itself. It may be that, contrary to what the president thinks, he might not be able to end this war in 4 weeks, because by that point, Iranian demands might have become, as he would see it, so excessive that it would be politically impossible for him to agree to them. In which case, we might not be looking at a war in the Middle East lasting weeks, 4 weeks, or months. It could be a war that drags on for much longer than that, for years, eventually, just as the Vietnam War did, with Iran sustaining that war with help from the Chinese and the Russians, just as North Vietnam got the help of those two powers to sustain its war against the United States. And of course, as we all know, that war, the war in Vietnam, ended with a complete pullback by the United States from Vietnam. All the enormous bases that the United States had created there were eventually dismantled. And that might, of course, conceivably also happen in the Middle East, though that took 10 years, and it might take, well, I'm not going to try and guess, but it might take at least as long in this crisis as well, if that is indeed what the Iranian demands are, and if Iran finds itself in a position where it is able to sustain the war for that long. Anyway, there it is. This is where we are in this conflict. Coming back now to the topic of the Russians and of the Chinese. I've already spoken about the things that the Russians have said. The Chinese have also now been active. Wang Yi has had a telephone call with the Iranian president, Abbas Araghchi. He has said that China supports Iran in Iran's defense of its sovereignty and independence. The word support is important because it may mean that China is prepared to take more help, to extend more help to Iran in the event that the war drags on. It might support Iran as Russia and China supported North Vietnam once upon a time by supplying weapons and technology. We continue to receive lots of satellite photos of American bases across the Middle East, now increasingly showing signs of damage. And of course, these satellite photos are increasingly coming from Chinese satellites, just to say. So China might continue to provide, in fact, even ramp up its support for Iran in military terms, thereby, by the way, conceivably making it possible for Iran to continue to produce missiles and drones. Russia might do the same. And of course, the other thing that Iran and China can do is that they can provide Iran with the economic and other assistance that Iran would need if it found itself indeed in a situation where it had to sustain a long war. And of course, China can do more. Now, China has recently blocked exports of rare earths to the United States on the basis that these were dual-use technologies. And of course, it is undoubtedly the case that rare earths, some of which China has a virtual monopoly of, are indeed essential for parts of the US military-industrial complex. Could it be that the longer this drags on, the Chinese might do the same? They could stop exports of rare earths to the United States until, as they put it, the conflict with Iran has ended. I've seen many different claims about how long it would take the United States to reproduce China's refining capabilities with respect to rare earths. Some put it optimistically at a year, others put it at as long as 20. I reckon 5 to 10 years at best. In which case, it seems to me that the United States, if it's cut off from Chinese rare earths, is going to find itself in even greater difficulties in waging this war. One reason why President Trump might want this war to end in 4 weeks is that at the end of this month, he's supposed to be traveling to China to meet Xi Jinping. I wonder whether that visit will go ahead whilst this war, if this war is still ongoing. I wonder whether the Chinese might decide to call it off, or whether Trump himself might decide to call it off. I wonder how the United States will react if the Chinese do decide to stop exports of rare earths. Of course, one thing that might make the Chinese more willing to do that is that it's become increasingly clear over the last few days that one of the objectives in this operation against Iran is to cut off supplies of oil from Iran and from other countries to China. I read a long article in the Daily Telegraph saying this very thing. And the Daily Telegraph is very well informed about the thinking of the neocons in the US administration, because even as that article is being published in the Daily Telegraph, there is an interview published by the Daily Telegraph with none other than Donald Trump himself, in which he bitterly complains about the fact that Keir Starmer's government in Britain delayed in allowing the United States to use British bases, including the one in Diego Garcia, to conduct the war against Iran. I said, by the way, in a recent video, that anybody who expected Keir Starmer to stick to his prohibition of the use of the bases in that way was being delusional. And we've seen that after 2 days, Keir Starmer's objections about the use by the Americans of those bases have fallen away. Well, there was an astonishing omission from this article in the Daily Telegraph about the cutting off of oil supplies to China, which is, of course, that the one country that was not mentioned was Russia. China, of course, now has a massive incentive in developing its energy partnership with Russia, and that surely is now going to happen. As I've said many times, China and Russia share not just common land borders, but common sea borders. Tankers filling up with oil are in Russia's Far Eastern ports, or by the way, it's Arctic ports. Oil and natural gas can sail all the way to China without leaving Russian or Chinese territorial waters. Expect to see over the next few years a massive investment by China in Russian energy infrastructure, the Chinese building pipelines, more pipelines. There's going to be surely a major acceleration of work on Power of Siberia 2 and on the building up of more oil pipelines between Russia and China, and the building with Chinese assistance of energy terminals, oil terminals, and refining capacity on the Russian Far East coast and in the Arctic. And, well, obviously, doing these things takes time, but nobody should have any doubt by now on the speed with which China can work and carry out these major infrastructure projects when it sees a strategic need to do so. Given that the Americans are now clearly seeking to cut off China from oil, it's inevitable that the Chinese are going to do these things, and it becomes far more likely that at some point over the next couple of days or weeks, the Chinese are going to respond by cutting off rare earths. They're going to say that it is impossible for China to continue to supply to rare earths to the United States when those are being used to conduct attacks by the United States against a fellow BRICS country. Especially now, when China has officially told Iran that it supports it in this war in which Iran is defending itself, in effect, against aggression. Now, as of this moment in time, the big beneficiaries of all of this, economically, are the Russians. Energy, the price of oil is surging. There's big question marks over the future supply of oil from the Persian Gulf and of LNG. The Russians, of course, are major producers and exporters of both. There's going to be, even if this war only continues for a few more weeks, inevitably going to be a flood of money into Russia's state coffers. I don't think that the problem of low oil prices last year was anywhere near as critical for the Russians as some people imagine. But for what it's worth, the Russians are going to be more flush with cash as a result of all of this. They're also inevitably going to benefit from the fact that there are fewer American missiles, both air-to-air missiles, by the way, and air defense missiles heading to Ukraine, because more and more of them are being used up fighting this war in the Middle East against Iran. That is going to make the Russian position easier in the conduct of the special military operation. And of course, from a Russian point of view, given that there is now growing concern in Europe about high energy costs in Europe and of the pressures this is going to bring on the European economy, as if high energy costs in Europe were not already a massive problem, and given that the Americans are already putting pressure on their European allies, or perhaps I should call them vassals, to come to their rescue in the Middle East. One wonders what these countries can realistically do there, by the way, but let's put that aside. Anyway, that also is going to mean less money and less weapons for Vladimir Zelensky. So, in the meantime, the Russians can get on with the special military operation. Trump is tied down. The Europeans are distracted the money is flooding in. And in fact, over the last few hours on the battlefields, there's been reports that the Russians have confirmed the capture of Drobyshevo near Liman, and they've also apparently there's now widespread reports that Grishino has fallen and that the Russians have captured more positions closer to Orekhov as well. All of this of little interest to people nowadays. Even I am not going to spend much time about it on this program. But bear in mind, the special military operation goes on. And from a Russian point of view, the Americans tied down in the Middle East is, in that respect, a benefit. To repeat a point I've made in recent programs, the fact that the Russians can wage a long war, that they can produce weapons and deploy huge numbers of troops and can keep going day after day, week after week, year after year, far from being the weakness that so many people in the West have been saying, is now revealed to be what it always was, a sign of strength. Whereas even Bloomberg is now saying that the American operation against Iran is a race between the achievement of the American goal, regime change in Iran, and the exhaustion of America's weapons stockpiles. A race, by the way, which the United States, at the moment, for the moment, appears to be losing. Well, I would like to believe that given that the Russians never seem to have faced these problems at any point in the war, that finally and at last I would have fewer people telling me how bad it is that the special military operation is taking as long as it is, that it's going on for 4 years, which, as I said, in terms of war is not that long, and that logically and properly, long ago, it should have all been over. The key thing, on the contrary, is that the Russians can wage long wars. They can plan for wars, as Willie O.M. said last week in a live stream that we did with him, whereas the United States cannot. Well, 3 days into the war, much going to have to happen. I will, of course, return to the topic of Ukraine before long, but this is where I'm going to end today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X and Substack. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.